Modo features a number of ways that you can add light into a 3D scene. And we're going to look at some of just the basic ideas and concepts of how light is added to a scene inside of Modo. So what we're looking at here is essentially the basic default illumination system for a scene in Modo. And this demonstrates two of the possible ways that we can light a scene. So if you look here at this sphere, which is sitting on just a ground plane, you'll see that there's a sphere. It's got some light coming over from the left-hand side, and it's casting a shadow onto the ground. The shadow is nice and sharp. And then if you also notice, there is a little bit of fill light that's coming in kind of from all around. So really what we're seeing here is essentially two different sources of light, or two sources of illumination rather. The directional light, which you can see here in my item list, is the light that is casting this shadow on the ground and providing us with this little bit of a hot spot here. Now, there are a number of different kinds of direct lights inside of Modo, and these are lights that appear as items in your scene and that you can manipulate, and they have properties specific to how they illuminate your scene. A directional light in this example is something akin to something like a sunlight. There are other lights that simulate spotlights, that simulate something like a light bulb. There are things that will look more like arrays of lights, like an LED panel or something like that. And those are different kinds of direct lights. It's an item that casts light into the scene, and they'll have different properties. We'll look at just some of them here so you can get an idea of how this works. So I'm taking the directional light now, and if I look at the properties, you can see it has position and orientation values. It has settings for radiant excidence, and all lights will have either this or a slightly different version of this that basically governs how bright they are. The default on this one is 3. If you can see, if I turn it down to something like 1, we'll look and see the scene gets dimmer. The highlight on the sphere gets more dim, and the shadow becomes less pronounced because now this light is casting essentially 1/3 the amount of light that it was previously. Go ahead and bump that back up to 3. Now you can also control the color of lights. So you've got RGB values here that you can either control by clicking and dragging on them directly, or you can click in this little swatch and you'll get a color picker up. So if I wanted to make this light a little bit warmer, let's give it a little bit of warmth to it. You can see now we're getting a little bit of warm color here, and that's allowing us to control the color of the light. I'm going to go ahead and set that back up to white. There is a shadow type control, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, but basically this will control the type of computation that goes into creating the shadow. And then there's some other properties here, which we're not going to get into at the moment, but suffice it to say that these will give us control over how this light illuminates our scene. And all directional lights will have different variations, but something similar to the options that you see here. So if I take and I disable this light, I'm just going to click the little eyeball to make it invisible. You can see that now we have just kind of a general ambient amount of lighting. And if I tilt the camera up a little bit here, you'll see that the scene is surrounded by a kind of a gradient, where up at the top of the sky here, there's a fairly light gray. Then down towards the edge and the horizon, you see a medium gray, and if we can see it down here underneath the plane, it goes down to a darker gray. And this is the default just general environment inside of Modo. It gives a very neutral and even amount of lighting, and just kind of will provide a little bit of fill light to the scene. So if I look down here under environments, you see we have one environment, and we have an environment material, which if I click on, you can see is just a 4-color gradient. Light gray, medium gray, and then dark gray at the bottom. So this just allows us to have a little bit of fill light so that things don't have super harsh shadows, so that we can pick up some details. Even if we have very few, or in this case, no lights in the scene, we can still see something illuminated. And this is based off of a type of rendering called global illumination, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But basically, it just allows for different sources of light, and that could be anything from these basic direct lights that we just talked about, to light coming from the environment, to light coming from objects, and also light bouncing off of one object and illuminating another. So, if there's something on the ground here that's being hit by a bright light, it's going to cast a little bit of light up onto this sphere, for example. All right, so that's two kinds of lighting here. I'm going to go ahead, and you can see here above my environment material, I just have a black color, which will basically just wipe out that gradient. Now you can see my scene actually goes to completely black because I've turned off my direct light, that's sunlight, and I've also turned off my environment. So I don't have anything filling the scene with light. But I have a folder here with some cubes in it, and all of these cubes have a material that's casting light. So that's our next type of light, which is called polygonal lighting. And this is light coming from polygons within the scene. So if I just click on this to make it visible and zoom out a little bit, you can see that we have a handful of cubes here that are essentially all just acting as small lights. Now, the benefit of this is that I can then have light integrated into my specific models. In this case, they're just simple cubes, but I could have any piece or any part of a texture on a specific item casting light into the scene, and you can get some good subtlety and nice realistic lighting by doing this. You might also notice that there is kind of this bit of undulation going on here in the render, and that's just due to the low quality of the preview. That's something that we'll have to deal with when we look more specifically at lighting, is how to clean this kind of thing up. But suffice it to say, each individual type of lighting is going to have different trade-offs that you'll make of speed of render versus quality, and finding a good balance of those is a discussion for when we get to rendering and lighting. All right, so you can see that now we have light coming from these cubes. It illuminates the scene. And if I take these lights and say move them down, go to items here. If I just take these lights and move them all down, you'll see that now they're lighting from different locations in space. So I'm going to move those back up, and you get the general idea. So basically, we have the control here to generate light from different areas of our models and different areas of our scene. We can use just a basic color of the environment around, and we can also use direct lights that are individual items. So the final type of light that we'll look at here, and I'm going to go ahead and hide those light cubes, is light coming from the environment, but also coming from an image. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize my render preview here for a minute. And I'm going to, in this lower half, go to my render preset browser. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a preset Modo environment, and these are photographic environments that are high dynamic range images, so images that contain more dynamic or brightness range than just a typical JPEG or TIFF file, and the extra brightness data is then used to calculate lighting within a scene. So I'm going to back up here. You can see that by default, Modo has a few different types of presets as far as these environments go. It has indoor, which is going to be, well, essentially indoor stuff. So interiors, parking garage, a bunch of different things there to look at. There is outdoor, which is the one that we were in initially, has different outdoor scenes. There is a Smart IBL environments folder, and these are ones that are a little bit higher quality, are going to have a few more options. Will usually take a little bit longer to render, but will give you a nice quality finished result. And then there is a folder of studio environments, and these are largely CG renders of environments, but doing the same basic job in order to light the scene. So let's back up here. I'm going to go to the indoor ones, and I'm going to choose the industrial one. So if I just double click on that, it's going to now drop that environment into my scene. So if I click the play button here to start my preview render, you'll see that now we have light coming from not that basic gradient that we had started with, but if I move my camera a bit, you can see that it's coming from this image of the interior of a warehouse of some sort. So the light that comes from this is going to be a little bit more varied and have a little bit more realistic nuance than it would if we're just using a simple gradient. I'm going to make that a little bit larger so that we can see it a bit better. And another one of the benefits of using images when you're working with lighting is that these will also affect the reflectivity of your objects. So you can see here on this sphere that I can kind of make out a little bit of some reflection of, if we zoom up here and we look at the top, there's a bit of a skylight up here. And you can actually see that skylight reflected, even though this is blurry reflections, you can see it reflected here in the surface of this sphere. Now, if I select the material for this and I make it less blurry, you'll actually start to see that environment reflected in the sphere, and actually the floor as well, because they have the same materials. So that's the basic kinds of lighting that we'll use when we're working inside of Modo. We have direct lights that are items. We have environment lights, which can be anything from a simple gradient or a simple flat color to more complex things like the images that we see here. And then we have polygonal lighting, or lighting that is coming from objects in the scene or models in the scene or sections of models in the scene. And all of these things combined together can be used to give you a good and compelling lighting scenario for your finished renders. Well, that does it for the basics. We'll move on in the next chapter to looking at the Modo user interface. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next chapter.